Can two opposing ideas work together and still remain in harmony and be productive? It's a challenging question to answer. So to answer that, let's start at the beginning. I mean, the very beginning. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God gave us light by giving us the sun, and the sun burns because it's actually exploding like an amazingly forceful nuclear bomb. But what keeps the sun from blowing up entirely? Well, its own massive gravity holds it together. So there are two things at work that let there be light, that amazing force of that nuclear reaction and the massive hold of gravity. And if it weren't for gravity, the nuclear reaction would cause the material of the sun to just explode outward and blow out like a birthday candle. And if it weren't for the amazing power of the nuclear reaction, the massive gravity would make the sun collapse and go cold like a rock. But God has balanced the two things perfectly, one pushing outward, one pulling inward. Because we have both, we have light and warmth. Without either one, darkness. Now, it's a lot of technical talk, and I don't want to bore you, so let me go back to the beginning. And I mean the beginning of our denomination. At the beginnings of Methodism in America, there were two forces at work, Robert Strawbridge and Francis Asbury. Both were lay preachers. One of them, Robert Strawbridge, was a convert to Wesleyan Methodism who immigrated to America with his wife because they saw great opportunity. The other, Francis Asbury, was a reluctant missionary, officially commissioned by John Wesley. Asbury compared himself to Jonah, being sent by God to a place he didn't really want to go. Now, John Wesley has begun his Methodist movement in England as a way to reform what he saw as a flawed Anglican church. And he hoped that his missionaries in America would bring discipline to a disorganized collection of provincial congregations. But what Francis Asbury discovered in America was that Wesley's concept of a modern reformation of the church was already obsolete in the colonies. These new Americans didn't want to perfect the English church. Asbury discovered that they were frontiers people. The characteristics of independence which brought these folks to the untamed new world made them resistant to authority and difficult to govern. Asbury saw that Americans had little concern for Wesley. In his journal, Asbury wrote, "Mr. Wesley was a man they had never seen, was 3,000 miles off. How might submission in such a case be expected?" So Asbury increasingly saw himself less and less as doing John Wesley's work, and more as doing God's work as interpreted by Francis Asbury. In his journal, he described his view of his mission this way: "I am going to live to God and bring others to do so." But if Asbury was to bring others to God, he had to find others. He had to learn where they were, not just physically, which was to say 2.2 million people spread out over an area the size of Britain, France, and Germany combined, but also to find them mentally and spiritually. Now, typical of where he finds his vast new parish, in a 1772 journal entry, while traveling in Western Maryland, he writes, "Men who neither feared God nor regarded men, swearers, liars, cockfighters, card players, horse racers, drunkards, etc., are now so changed as to become new men, and they are filled with the praise of God. This is the Lord's work, and it is marvelous in our eyes." In 1773, Asbury was assigned to the Baltimore preaching circuit, which was then the most dense population of Methodists in America. This cradle of Methodism owed its existence in large part to the work of another preacher assigned to Baltimore City Station, Robert Strawbridge. Strawbridge had been preaching and establishing Methodist classes in America since about 1761. It's his ministry that Asbury refers to when speaking of the transformation of the swearers, liars, and drunkards. Like Asbury, Strawbridge felt his true call was from God. And while Strawbridge also demonstrates a passion for the Wesleyan model of Methodism and itinerant preaching, he was not sent by Wesley. Robert Strawbridge was born and raised in Ireland. He and his wife, Elizabeth, moved to America as part of a tidal wave of immigration in the 1760s. For Robert, it was an opportunity to spread Methodism to a new and spiritually hungry populace. Robert is credited in Asbury's journals as being the first preacher to establish Methodism in America. He began a house church in his own home. He built the first Methodist meeting house in America in 1764. He wrote a far-ranging, if unofficial and unassigned, circuit, planting Methodist classes and societies in Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. He performed the first Methodist baptism, and he administered what was called the ordinances, in other words, Holy Supper, or communion. Robert's lay ministry filled a particular hole in the spiritual life of American Methodists. As American colonies moved closer to rebellion, the ministers of the King's Church began to go back to England, and people found themselves without any appointed clergy at all. Strawbridge took it himself as their spiritual leader to perform the ordinances, communion, as necessary. Now, this became a much noted and discussed source of disagreement between Strawbridge and Asbury, and one that people still debate today. And again, in his journals, Asbury writes about a December 1772 quarterly meeting in Harford County, and he says, "Brother Strawbridge pleaded much for the ordinances, and so did the people, who seemed much biased by him. I told them I would not agree to it at that time, and insisted upon our abiding by the rules." Now, arriving in America only a decade after Strawbridge, Asbury didn't meet people who felt restricted by rule, but due to their advanced state of rebellion, he found a people without rule. Where Strawbridge had to kindle and spread Methodism, Asbury needed to tame and gather it. Where Strawbridge needed to galvanize, Asbury needed to organize. Strawbridge was a rebel. Asbury, cast into a rebellious country, needed to be law. Strawbridge had a kind of freedom to be a pioneer in new lands. Asbury was burdened with that much less glamorous task to be the administrator, to be the one to take grand ideas and passions and turn them into workable systems and procedures. And not that we should in any way discount Asbury's pioneering efforts. His were the first hoofprints in many settlements, and many were brought into Methodism, if not any life of faith at all, by his preaching. But where Strawbridge was pushing outward, Asbury was drawing together. In this way, circumstances made it impossible that Asbury and Strawbridge should ever be entirely in agreement. Beginning at opposite ends of the road, they either rode in different directions or else rode at one another like jousters, each ready to knock the other off his high horse. Like the accelerator and the brake, both were necessary parts of the vehicle that established Methodism in America. Strawbridge providing the nuclear explosion, Asbury being the steady hold of gravity. Together they brought light. But still, wouldn't it have been good if Asbury and Strawbridge could have gotten along better? Could have worked together more? Wouldn't they have been more productive if they had both had exactly the same idea about how to build the church? And we've seen times of relative peace and harmony in the denomination. We in the church of the early part of the 21st century look back at the church of our youth, or our parents' and grandparents' youth, and we tell ourselves that those times were so great and we've lost so much. We have this perfect image of the perfect past, and our times seem to suffer in comparison. But this is the wrong view of what our Christian church typically looked like. Historically, that was a blip, but not what Christ Church is. So what is Christ Church? And by this I mean the movement started by Jesus of Nazareth. What does it look like? Well, it looks a lot like the church of today. And it looks a lot like the church in which Robert Strawbridge and Francis Asbury began to minister. In each of these three eras, the world seemed sinful and secular and shallow. In each age, the church needed to be built, and that building was an uphill battle. We don't often talk of Asbury and Strawbridge in this light, but remember, they were wartime preachers. Strawbridge began his American crusade about 1761 when tensions were flaring. And Asbury was appointed to the Baltimore Circuit in 1773, the very dawn of the independence movement. This means that when we think of Asbury and Strawbridge riding out on the circuit, we should think of them as activists, living in a time of international tensions, social change, economic instability, and cultural divisiveness. We should remember that the states were not united states, and for the most part, they didn't want to be. The various colonies had very different cultures and values. The political debate in the land was about being loyal to the country, that country being Britain. Political divide, international uncertainty, social change. Do these times sound familiar? So how could Strawbridge and Asbury thrive and succeed in such times, even while challenging each other? Maybe they too looked at the early days of the church, at what Christ and his disciples did to build the movement out of nothing. Maybe they saw in those times an echo of their own, just as we may hear an echo of their time in ours. Maybe they realized that the Church of Jesus Christ was never meant to be the easy and comfortable ride. Maybe they saw that the long and hard road was not full of obstacles, but opportunity. The arid and rocky soil is in fact the true fertile ground of the Christian church. You see, the church and the ministry of Christ has endured all these years because it offers real hope and real meaning when people feel overwhelmed, marginalized, lost, or alone. Jesus did not live in stable times, and he didn't seek out the healthy and the wealthy. He lived in a land occupied by a foreign power and went to the poor, the widows, and the slaves. In our day, we've seen the church wither and shrink when it became comfortable and routine. When churches were filled with people who were already satisfied, we didn't know it, but the church was already dying. Complacency is the disease which is killing the church. If the church is only home to the congregation, then it's nothing more than a fading photograph of the past. And what we learn from Asbury and Strawbridge's opposing work is that the church grows best when it serves best, in times of challenge and unrest and disquiet. Our most active and passionate members will not be those raised in the church, but those who have come into the church after knowing how cold it was outside. We learn that people don't always need God for the same reasons. Some need fire and passion and outwardness. Others need calm and order and introspection. Now, if the early church had only been Asbury or only been Strawbridge, then there might not have been a later church. We remember these founders not because they were first, but because they were so successful. They taught us that we need to stop complaining about our situation and see the current state of the church as a great opportunity for growth. Growth by sacrifice, by saving souls who are drowning, by sharing good news to those who haven't heard, and by offering real hope and lasting peace to our world, which feels restless. See, we have something to offer which is very much in need. We have so much more chance to do good than did the churchgoers of a more comfortable time. But like Asbury and Strawbridge, we need to leave our comfort and go where the conflict is. We need to show a divided world is not as different as we fear, because we all have the same spark of holy breath. We're all brother and sister with the same parent. This is how Jesus showed us to do church.